The Atlantic Ocean in 1940 was not a battlefield. It was a slaughterhouse. From the periscopes of their Type 7 U-boats, German commanders looked out at a horizon filled with the silhouettes of slow-moving Allied merchant ships. To the men of the Kriegsmarine, the Americans were amateurs, weekend sailors who had no place in the lethal game of modern naval warfare. Adolf Hitler and Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz were convinced that the U-boat was the ultimate weapon, a silent predator that would starve Great Britain into submission. They called this period the happy time. The German captains became celebrities, their hulls decorated with the kill counts of thousands of tons of sunken steel. They operated with near impunity, surfacing in the middle of convoys at night to pick off targets like wolves in a sheepfold. To them, the vast gap in the middle of the Atlantic, the air gap, was their sanctuary, a place where no Allied plane could reach them. They laughed at the thought of American intervention. They believed their Wolfpacks were invincible. The geography of the Atlantic War was defined by a terrifying void. Allied land-based aircraft could protect the coasts of America and Britain, but in the center of the ocean, there was a hole 1,500 miles wide. This was the Black Pit. Once a convoy entered this zone, they were blind and defenseless from above. For days, merchant sailors would scan the gray skies, praying for the sight of a friendly wing, knowing that beneath the waves, the gray wolves were stalking them. The U-boats didn't even need to stay submerged. They would cruise on the surface, using their superior speed to position themselves for the kill. The German commanders mocked the Allied air forces, calling them clipping-winged birds. They were convinced that no aircraft could carry enough fuel and enough weaponry to patrol the heart of the Atlantic. They were wrong. They hadn't met the B-24 Liberator. The consolidated B-24 Liberator was not a beautiful aircraft. It was boxy, difficult to fly, and looked like a flying shipping crate. American pilots initially looked at it with skepticism compared to the elegant B-17 Flying Fortress. But the Liberator had a secret: the Davis wing. This high aspect ratio wing gave the B-24 incredible lift and, more importantly, immense fuel capacity. While other bombers struggled to stay airborne for 8 hours, the Liberator could stay up for 16. It was a long-range beast. But for it to become the U-boat's nightmare, it needed more than just fuel. It needed eyes. In the secret labs of MIT and British research centers, a new technology was being perfected: the centimetric radar. Small enough to fit in the nose of a bomber, this radar could see a U-boat's snorkel or conning tower from miles away, even through thick fog or the pitch-black darkness of a stormy Atlantic night. The amateurs were about to bring the light of science into the Black Pit. The transition happened almost overnight. In early 1943, U-boat commanders began to report strange occurrences. Submarines that were supposed to be safe in the middle of the air gap were suddenly being jumped by heavy four-engine bombers. There was no warning. The B-24s would drop out of the clouds, their bomb bays opening to reveal a new kind of terror: the Torpex-filled depth charge. The Germans were baffled. How were they being found? They checked for spies. They checked their radio codes, but they couldn't conceive that a plane could detect them on the surface from 20 miles away. The laughter in the U-boat bunkers turned into a tense, vibrating silence. The hunter was no longer alone in the woods. The happy time was dead, but replaced by a new era of aerial execution. If the radar was the Liberator's eyes, the Leigh Light was its sword. German commanders had long relied on the cover of darkness to recharge their batteries on the surface. They felt safe in the obsidian black of the ocean night. But the Americans and British began equipping B-24s with a massive carbon arc searchlight under the wing. A U-boat would be cruising peacefully at 2 a.m. Suddenly, the sky would explode with 2 million candle power of blinding white light. Before the German watch could even scream alarm, the Liberator would be at mast height, straddling the hull with a string of depth charges. The survival rate for a U-boat caught in a Leigh Light attack was near zero. The German sailors began to develop a psychological condition known as aircraft fever. Every cloud, every star, every shadow was now a potential B-24 waiting to send them to the bottom of the abyss. The climax of the struggle took place in the Bay of Biscay, the gateway for U-boats leaving the French ports. The Allies turned this stretch of water into a gauntlet of death. Admiral Dönitz, desperate to regain the initiative, ordered his U-boats to stay on the surface and fight it out with their anti-aircraft guns. It was a catastrophic mistake. The B-24s were flying fortresses in their own right. They would dive through the flak, their .50 caliber machine guns shredding the exposed German gunners on the bridge. This was no longer naval warfare, it was an execution from the sky. In the summer of 1943 alone, the U-boat arm lost nearly 100 submarines. The elite of the Kriegsmarine, the heroes of the happy time, were being obliterated by the amateurs they had once mocked. The B-24 Liberator had effectively closed the air gap, turning the Atlantic into a graveyard for Hitler's naval ambitions. The technical evolution of the B-24 during this period was relentless. It wasn't just about the radar or the lights, it was about the specialized weaponry. The Americans introduced the Mark 24 Fido, an acoustic homing torpedo that could hear the U-boat's propellers and track it even if it managed to dive. The German sailors realized that the ocean, which had once been their protector, was now a transparent trap. Even beneath the surface, there was no hiding from the technological superiority of the American industrial machine. The B-24 crews, often ignored in the glory of the strategic bombing campaigns over Germany, were fighting a silent, lonely war that decided the fate of the entire world. Without them, the supplies would never have reached Europe. Without them, D-Day would have been impossible. By 1945, the U-boat service had the highest casualty rate of any branch in the German military. Out of 40,000 men who went to sea, 30,000 never returned. They weren't defeated by a bigger navy. They were defeated by American industrial logic and the relentless patrol of the B-24 Liberator. The amateurs had built 18,000 Liberators, more than any other American aircraft in history. They had bridged the impossible gap and turned the ocean into a transparent trap. As the survivors of the U-boat arm looked at the charred remains of their fleet at the end of the war, they realized the terrible truth. They had laughed at the flying box, but the box had become their coffin. This is the story of how the B-24 Liberator hunted the gray wolves to oblivion, proving that in modern war, arrogance is the first step toward defeat. By the final months of the war, the atmosphere inside a German U-boat had shifted from one of predatory confidence to that of a funeral procession. The air inside the iron hulls was thick with the smell of diesel, sweat, and the unwashed bodies of 40 men who knew they were likely breathing their last. Every time the hydrophone operator picked up a distant rhythmic thrumming, the entire crew went silent. Was it a destroyer? Or was it the four-engine shadow from the sky? The gray wolves were now starving, hunted, and exhausted. They were being picked off faster than the German shipyards could replace them. Admiral Dönitz, once the architect of Allied terror, could only watch as his elite force was systematically erased from the map. The B-24 Liberator had done more than just sink ships. It had broken the spirit of the Kriegsmarine. The Germans had banked everything on the invisibility of the submarine, but American innovation had made the ocean transparent. Darkness was no longer a shield. Distance was no longer a sanctuary. The amateurs from the American Midwest had combined the cold logic of mass production with the cutting edge of microwave radar and acoustic torpedoes to solve the Atlantic problem. They had turned the mid-Atlantic gap from a U-boat paradise into a high-altitude firing range. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the statistics told a grim story. The U-boat arm had suffered the highest loss rate of any combat organization in history. But as the Allied convoys finally sailed into European ports, unmolested and triumphant, the B-24 Liberators continued their lonely patrols overhead, a final salute to the thousands of merchant sailors who had died in the Black Pit before the air gap was closed. The B-24 was never as famous as the Spitfire or the B-17, but it was the workhorse that carried the weight of the world's supply lines on its boxy wings. The boxed, ugly, difficult-to-fly shipping crate had achieved what no battleship could. It had hunted the most feared predators of the deep to the brink of extinction. It proved that in the crucible of modern conflict,
up into brilliant incandescent explosions, shedding wings, engines, and tails as they billowed into the ground. Several times, Liberators were caught in the flames flaring up from the damaged refineries below. Colonel John Kane's B-24 went right through one such funnel of fire.
Still haunts the history of the
When
sea.
the 98th
The
came
hunter
in,
became the
Kane
hunted, And the happy time
turned
ended
at
in
the
the
proper
cold,
place,
dark oblivion of the deep.
went to